reduce, reuse, and recycle.
Well, everybody knows about Greenpeace. Not so many people know about the story of Pollution Probe.
An interview with Ryan O'Connor about Pollution Probe and the history of environmental activism in Ontario. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 47 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. Environmental activism has a long history in Canada. Like others around the world, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Canadians became involved in a number of environmental non-governmental organizations, or ENGOs. Picking up on a prevailing spirit of protest during the era, several environmental problems surfaced as popular political issues: air pollution, water pollution, solid waste disposal, among many others. Out of this came one of the first ENGOs in Canadian history, Pollution Probe. Born at the University of Toronto in 1969, the nascent group focused its efforts on new concerns regarding air pollution in Canada. It would go on to become one of the most influential environmental groups in Ontario and even shape a national environmental movement across the country. Scholarly research on the history of the environmental movement in Canada is limited. A couple of years ago, we published 2 episodes of Nature's Past on the history of the Canadian environmental movement. Today, there are a handful of new books on the topic, including the recently published The First Green Wave, Pollution Probe and the Origins of Environmental Activism in Ontario. The author of this book, Ryan O'Connor, joined me to tell us more about Pollution Probe and the early years of environmental activism in Canada.
My name is Ryan O'Connor. I'm an historian of Canada and the environmental movement, and I'm affiliated with Trent University. I'm a research associate of the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ryan, and spending a little bit of time today to talk about your new book, The First Green Wave, Pollution Probe and the Origins of Environmental Activism in Ontario. I'm quite excited to discuss this book with you because I think it's quite important, and there hasn't been a lot of scholarly literature by historians about environmental activism in Canada, so I'm really interested to see where Pollution Probe fits into this. But why don't we begin by learning a little bit about how you started the project, why you picked the topic, how you came to Pollution Probe.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to start. I consider myself to be a green. I've been concerned about the environment since I was a kid. I used to camp with my family. I always loved trees and animals, all those good things. If we go back to elementary school, I would have science fair projects about acid rain and about composting. So these are issues that were always important to me. I took the course as an undergraduate at the University of Prince Edward Island. Ian Dobigan had a course he offered for the very first time my 4th year on the history of environmentalism in Canada and the United States. And of course, I realized at the time it was pretty much all about the United States because that's where the sources were from. And when I got to my PhD, I realized this is something I would like to work on. And when I began my investigation of what was out there, as you mentioned, there really wasn't much by historians. There was some by people that worked on public policy and politics, but it might mention a bit of history, but there wasn't much to it. There was a lot about Greenpeace, which, of course, there's a lot of books about it, especially Frank Zelko's Make It a Greenpeace, which, it wasn't out at the time, but his PhD was out, had been completed. And I realized, well, there's a lot more to environmental activism in Canada than Greenpeace. It's a influential group, especially globally, but it started in 1971. As Frank Zelko says, it's not particularly Canadian in its influences. I mean, it did come out of Vancouver, but what was happening there, but in the counterculture, the New Left, the war resistors, the Quakers that went up there, a whole lot of stuff that didn't seem to be representative of Canada. And I know that's it's hard to pinpoint something that's representative of Canada, but it didn't seem to be very representative at all.
It was much more internationally focused, right?
Yeah. It quickly became a a European-based group.
Hmm.
And just the tactics and the influences, I wanted to see what else there was. So, being based out of Ontario, I came across Pollution Probe, scattered references,
Hmm.
and I noticed that it still existed, but there really wasn't any good history written on it. Maybe some recollections of former members in their 30th anniversary publication, but nothing solid. So as I looked into it, I saw that they're a really interesting group that did a lot of good and were very, very prominent. It turns out that if you look at the work of Neil Forkey,
Hmm.
he suggests that the two most prominent groups in Canada during the 70s were Pollution Probe and Greenpeace. Well,
Hmm.
everybody knows about Greenpeace. Not so many people know about the story of Pollution Probe, and it's completely different. And yeah, that's how I got into it.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question. Then, I mean, some listeners might not know what Pollution Probe is. Where did it begin? What was the origin of the organization?
Yeah, Pollution Probe was founded at the University of Toronto in 1969. It was inspired by a documentary on the CBC called The Air of Death. And The Air of Death was very well viewed. There's, millions of Canadians saw it.
Hmm.
It highlighted the problem of air pollution throughout the country. It brought home the point that you can't just dismiss pollution as a problem in the United States, and you can't dismiss it as an urban problem because there's a very controversial segment about air pollution in the Dunnville, Ontario area, and that's an agricultural town.
Hmm.
And the pollution that was affecting the farmers there, it was killing their crops, it was crippling their cattle, and according to the documentary, it was also making humans sick from fluorosis. The superphosphate company responsible, it was owned by the Electric Reduction Company, uh, they didn't take well to this documentary highlighting their pollution
Hmm.
problems. So there's a campaign to discredit the CBC. There's a couple public inquiries. It turns out that sitting on the board of ERCO was Chancellor of University of Toronto, Roman Salant.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's also the chairman of the Science Council of Canada at the time, so a very prominent
Hmm.
figure. And these people are working behind the scenes to totally discredit the CBC. The fact that there is a university connection, it really concerned students at the University of Toronto. So the Varsity, which is the student newspaper,
Hmm.
began to write about this. Eventually, they decide they're going to submit a brief to the CRTC inquiry into the documentary. While working on that, they came across the chair of the Department of Zoology at the University of Toronto, Donald Chant. He suggested they should form a permanent group. They call a meeting, hundreds of people come out, and they form Pollution Probe. And that's really where it started. The concern about the public good and the fact that the people bringing a message for the public good was leading to effective, blacklisting or attempts
Hmm.
to blacklist. So it came out of that and the whole cultural milieu of the 1960s in Toronto.
Yeah. So, is Pollution Probe was one of the earliest sort of self-consciously environmental groups or environmental activist groups in Canada. Is that right?
Yes, around this time, there's very few of what we would now call environmental activist groups. There's the more old line conservation groups that were concerned with wilderness
Hmm.
or, conservation of resources. But to get into pollution and the ecosystems, all those sort of things that we use to define an environmental activist group today. Uh, Another group formed earlier than Pollution Probe as a result of the Air of Death in Toronto called the Group Action to Stop Pollution. They were formed in 1967, immediately after the Air of Death was
Hmm.
broadcast, but they didn't last as an organization. They
Hmm.
more or less went defunct within a year and a half. In British Columbia, you have SPEC, who form in 1969 as well. So there's a few groups across the country that pop up around 1969, but more so it's the early 70s where they really begin to flourish around 1970, 1971.
So maybe this is a more complicated follow-up then, but you suggest that pollution probe emerges in the context of the late 1960s. What is it that was happening at that time that would lead to the foundation of some of these early environmental groups? What is that late 1960s milieu?
Well, there's a lot of protest on campuses across the country, as well as in other countries. You know, you speak of the spirit of the 1960s. In Canada, there was protests regarding American involvement in the war in Vietnam. Yeah, you know, they'd be protesting outside of consulates and embassies. Students were protesting for more power within the universities to have more of a say over their education and the way universities are run. There's the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement. There's a lot going on there. And environmentalism was something that it was still a new term for people. You know, as Monty Hummel liked to say, when I spoke to him, he mentioned in the late 60s, there were no ministers of the environment, no environmental protection acts, and pollution was a brand new word. But people were starting to pay a lot of attention to this. In the 60s, early 70s, there's a lot of important books coming out of Canada and the United States. I mean, none are more well-renowned than Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. That's inspiring people, getting them to think about the place of synthetic chemicals in the environment. So people were ready to act. It just took some galvanizing, I believe, and local concerns leading people to act.
So you said off at the top that Pollution Probe was somewhat different than other environmental non-governmental organizations, ENGOs. How would you characterize Pollution Probe? What made it different from other ENGOs?
Yeah, it's very unique from what I was able to come across beforehand, because most people will say that environmental groups from the outset have been part of the political left. And what I found with Pollution Probe, it was very much results oriented. It wasn't ideological. It had its conservative base. It, of course, had people from the left, people from all over the political spectrum. That was part of their power. They were able to just come up with solutions that worked based on the scenarios in front of them. But what I found really fascinating is that despite coming from this cross spectrum of students and faculty at the University of Toronto, they had this early leadership core from elite positions within society. So the woman who came up with the name of the group, Sherry Bridson, she was the journalist at the Varsity that really got things going. She is the granddaughter of Roy Thompson, who was the richest individual in the country. And, you know, being in Toronto, you'd be familiar with Roy Thompson Hall.
Yeah.
So, other leaders early on were from Upper Canada College, which is that elite private institution in Toronto. So from the very beginning, Pollution Probe knew how to deal with the powers that be. And they had this position that we can work with people, whether it's government or the business community, and get positive solutions. Now, that was kind of their default. Let's work with people, what we would now call stakeholders, I suppose. But at the time, they had to elbow the way in for environmentalists because they weren't represented in decision-making scenarios. So they were very different. They also, it should be noted, while they were on the lookout for opportunities to work with people, they weren't afraid to embarrass companies or the government and criticize them in the public. So on the one hand, they want to work with people. On the other, if they don't find people to be cooperative, they'll take them on. And I think they did a very effective job doing that.
And you highlight a couple of, I don't know how to characterize these, sort of publicity stunts that Pollution Probe held. I think the best illustration in the book is the mock funeral for the death of the Don River.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was very early on in Pollution Probe's history. Uh, they had just been formed months earlier. And while they had gained some local prominence throughout Toronto, I believe that the funeral for the Don Rivers what really brought them to a national level. The idea behind it was that the Don River, such a prominent figure within Toronto, was effectively dead, and people seem to be taking this for granted. They want this to not be the status quo. They want people to say, why is this water dirty? Why can't we swim in it? Why can't we drink from it? Why can't we fish? So they decide to hold the funeral. So, beginning at Convocation Hall, they have a procession to the banks of the Don, the Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto, I should say. So, they have a 100-car procession. They unload a makeshift casket. They take it to the banks of the Don. There's a couple hundred mourners there, dressed up, some of them in costume. There's one individual reads from the diary of Elizabeth Simcoe. She's the wife of the first lieutenant governor of Ontario. And in these diary entries, they talked about how beautiful the Don used to be, how tasty the water was, and the abundant fish in there. There's another member who's portraying a wealthy industrialist named Simon Greed. He's in top hat with a dollar sign on it. He's insulting all the people that are gathered in what ends up being a 40-minute ceremony led by the U of T's campus chaplain. Simon Greed gets pied in the face. People cheer. They all have a real good time, and then they break off. Now, this ends up getting tons of media coverage. It's on the front page of the Globe and Mail. It's in the Toronto Star, all the local press. It's in the CBC National News, CTV. In fact, the woman who was reading from the diary of Elizabeth Simcoe, she told me in an interview that she got a call from family in Vancouver saying, "Meredith, you're on the cover of the Vancouver Sun." This is something that really brought them to this national forefront, being early in as environmentalists, and being able to have these real fun, interesting to pay attention to, guerrilla theater events.
And the organization seemed incredibly adept at capturing media attention after that they were regularly writing articles in the Toronto Star and having their work featured in the Globe and Mail and having a real national media impact.
Yeah, that was something that was very interesting. It helps that they were based at Toronto, where so many of our national, news media organizations are based out of. But again, they knew how to get the attention and how to run with it. Another incident shortly thereafter, they weighed into the debate concerning phosphate content in detergents. And at that time, there's the problem of cultural eutrophication, especially noticeable in the Great Lakes. And while international government was dealing with this, it was a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucracy, so they're dragging their feet. In order to raise awareness and focus people and attention on this issue, Pollution Probe decided that it would wade in. So at the time, the phosphate content wasn't listed on laundry detergent boxes or the packaging. So over the Christmas holidays in 1969, a bunch of student volunteers spent their time testing and analyzing phosphate content in various popular laundry detergents. And they came up with a list that said, name of the brand and product and how much phosphate was in it. And they launched this list on live CBC News, a 12-minute segment on phosphate and its effect on waters. And this list becomes tremendously influential. They get over 7,000 requests in their office at the U of T for copies of the list. It gets reprinted in newspapers, magazines, newsletters, and it even gets displayed in stores in the grocery aisles. And so what we see there is they're tapping into the media to address an issue that's dragging along.
Mm-hmm.
They manage to convince people that they should, go for the greener option, vote with your dollars. If you care about the environment, there are better options. And now there's no excuse because we're telling you what the better options are. So if you care about it, here's a way to act. And again, that's something that further solidified their reputation very early on as national leaders for the environmental movement.
So, after this early period in the history of Pollution Probe, do you think that the organization was just a product of the late 1960s and the early 1970s, or did it change and evolve with broader changes in the environmental movement?
Oh, they definitely evolved throughout the 1970s. It's evident they didn't know how to run an organization, especially an environmental activist organization. So they evolved in their structure as well as the issues they addressed. I mean, you see it right there in the name, Pollution Probe. The first things that concerned them were air pollution and water pollution, but very quickly they just allowed their volunteers to address whatever concerns they had, let it be noise pollution, radiation, recycling. So they play important roles in many of these issues, but they're at the forefront of many issues as well. When you look at the literature on the history of environmental activism in Canada, the United States, globally, it's often said that people began to pay attention to energy issues as they relate to the environment after the energy crisis of 1973. But Pollution Probe was working on it before that. They had realized that the growth ethos behind Ontario Hydro, which was talking about expanding its production every year on a constant basis rather than conserving energy, they realized that was a big issue and had to be addressed. Because what are bigger polluters in many cases than the infrastructure that's creating energy for us, using fossil fuels, for example. So they addressed that early on. They got into environmental justice before environmental justice was a label or a subfield. Again, that's something that people connect with the 1980s and the Love Canal in New York. But Pollution Probe was working in that area in the early, mid-1970s. They were doing work helping, working class immigrant populations in the inner city, where you would find old, dirty factories grandfathered into residential areas. So in one example, there was a factory that was heavily polluting in a neighborhood, and Pollution Probe got a grant to rent a storefront, and they hired staff to work with the local community. They hired a woman who could speak Italian so she could reach out to the recent immigrants who weren't comfortable with English or couldn't speak English at all. And they just tried to empower them to let them know what their options were, what things they could do, and how they could rally and respond to the concerns confronting them. So as you can see, within just a year or so, they're moving far beyond traditional pollution concerns into a much broader range of issues. Again, they played a very important role with recycling. The term 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, that's a Pollution Probe creation. That's something worldwide that we associate with recycling.
Yeah, that stood out to me, and readers should take note of that, where that came from.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of innovation when it comes to recycling in Ontario. While the title of my book is Pollution Probe and the Origins of Environmental Activism in Ontario, I look at it as kind of a study of the development of an environmental community within an area, Toronto and Ontario more broadly. And there's a group that I wrote about in the book called the IS5 Foundation, and they eventually were responsible for the creation of the Blue Box which is another globally recognized symbol of recycling. So two of the fundamental symbols of recycling globally came right out of Ontario.
So, in the history of Pollution Probe as an organization, you argue that it kind of reaches a peak in the mid 1970s in terms of its size and its influence. What led to the organization's decline?
Well, it all depends how you look at it, I suppose. But what happens in the mid 1970s is it's a lot harder to fund the activities of an environmental group. After the 1973 energy crisis, more and more foundations and even government funding, private industry, they're putting their money into energy issues. They want to address alternative energy. You know, you have demonstration sites that pop up. You have the ARC on Prince Edward Island. In Ontario, well, in Toronto, we have Ecology House, which became a pollution probe, well, a project and their headquarters. So that becomes an issue. So it's harder to fund what they're doing. This leads to the creation of a semi-autonomous sister organization to Pollution Probe, Energy Probe, which started off as a team within Pollution Probe looking at energy issues, but they go semi-autonomous because it's easier for them to raise funds that way because energy is right there in their name. Now, Energy Probe splits from Pollution Probe in 1980 over, again, fundraising issues. And Energy Probe continues. It still operates today, as does Pollution Probe, although Energy Probe is the black sheep of the Canadian environmental movement. It's where Lawrence Solomon, the well-known climate change skeptic or denier, if you want to use the name of his book. So they're more recognized for their free market principles, which when you look at the environmental movement, most people want to enact more regulations to protect the environment. Well, here's a neocon organization that once was part of Pollution Probe, but now is totally independent. And I should say that this free market neocon twist happens after the 1980 split with Pollution Probe.
Right. Yeah, that was an interesting twist in the narrative that Energy Probe at one point then receives financing from the oil industry and then becomes sympathetic or an apologist for oil or an advocate of oil as an energy source?
Yeah, they've been accused of a lot of things. From the beginning, they've been anti-nuclear. Well, I suppose when Energy Probe, at the very beginning, when it came to as a sister organization, they were critical of the nuclear industry, but they weren't full-blown anti. Yeah. But as the 70s wore on, and definitely as it went independent in the 80s, they've always been anti-nuclear. So when they look at other forms of energy, you know, they've been critical of hydro in the past. They're very critical of mega projects involving damming and things of that nature. Again, you can question whether that's ideological and based on the fact that mega projects involve public funding more often than not. So yeah, they've come under fire for what they support and also where the funding for it comes from.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating part of the book, and I think you make some important insights about the significance of how ENGOs are funded and what relationship that has to the kind of activities that they can conduct, the kind of issues that they can address. And you make an interesting argument about the significance of the 1973 energy crisis on the environmental movement in Canada. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Shucks, I'm thinking of what my point was there.
Well, I was thinking in particular of a couple of federal grant projects. There's a youth grant project and another one that not just Pollution Probe, but a lot of youth organizations across Canada in the 1960s and 1970s relied on grants from these two federal programs. And when those started to dry up, that, at least in the case of Pollution Probe, it seemed to me, started to change the organization.
Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, I see what we were talking about. Yeah, in the early 70s, the late 60s, there were a lot of government make work programs. And you see this in various social movements within the country.
Hmm.
There's opportunities for youth. That was one of the most prominent ones. And these were short-term employment programs to, get young people working. Groups such as Pollution Probe were really good at getting funding through this. But, by the time we get to the energy crisis and the economy goes south, funding for programs such as Opportunities for Youth is cut. And the environmental movement has to look elsewhere for its funding. And this is where we see Energy Probe first emerge because they're able to get money because of their focus, and then separate because they find themselves better able to fundraise than the partner at Pollution Probe. So the environmental movement in general throughout the late 70s has a lot of trouble and difficulty raising money to do the work they need to do. And this leads in many cases to downsizing, to finding and carving out your niche area. And that's something to keep in mind about Pollution Probe in the early years. When it was the one big environmental activist group in Toronto, they addressed everything. But as time wore on, they were spinning off other groups. They were responsible for spinning off the Canadian Environmental Law Association, for example, and other groups independent of them began to arise in Toronto, such as Greenpeace Toronto, the aforementioned Is5 Foundation with recycling. All of these groups started to pop up, and Pollution Probe had to focus its energies better. That led to some difficulty and some hard decisions, but that leads to major changes in the organization.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the research that you did for this book. I think listeners would be interested to learn a little bit about the research sources that you were using, and in particular, can you tell us about the oral history interviews that you did?
Absolutely. Yeah. Anytime you start a project like this, your first concern is, are there the sources out there? And I started digging, and I was lucky. It was there. First at the Ontario Archives, they had some substantial reports and other primary sources relating to Pollution Probe. I also got into the Pollution Probe internal archives at their headquarters and got to find in there all kinds of old newsletters dating back to their founding. They didn't have a lot to dealing with the early years, but they had what I needed, the stuff that wasn't at the archives. So that was great. It laid a basis. Pollution Probe was all over the media. In the early 70s, they were in the Globe and Mail on average once a week, twice a week in the Toronto Star. Add the student newspapers. There was all kinds of records there. But I still found that, there's something missing. So I began to seek out its former members, its early leaders. And I was fortunate in being able to find these people with the help of Google. So, I started off, the first people I spoke to were, I guess, Don Chant, who was, the faculty, major faculty supporter, chair of the Department of Zoology, who made them an official project of the University of Toronto's Department of Zoology. I then spoke to Monty Hummel, who was one of the early employees and now President Emeritus of World Wildlife Fund of Canada. And I spoke to Peter Middleton, who was the first executive director of Pollution Probe. So those were the first three people I spoke to for the project. And especially, I was able to find more people with their help and their advice. They may not have spoken to somebody in 30 years, but they could, point me, like, the last time I spoke to this person. He was moving up to the Yukon. You might find him there. And then go to Google and so it was a bit of investigative work to track people down, but I was able to do it, and I ended up interviewing just under 70 people, mostly pollution probe. But again, I got into the broader environmental activist community, so I spoke to people about the founding of Greenpeace Toronto, the work of the IS5 Foundation, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Zero Population Growth, all those groups. And it was very interesting to get their perspective and have them fill in some of those document gaps. And I was also able to talk to politicians who, were supportive of Pollution Probe and some business supporters. So, I think I was able to get a fairly broad perspective on things.
Yeah, the oral history work is quite extensive in this book, and I think it makes it, in some respects, one of a kind. It occurred to me as I was reading it, though, the number of passages you quoted from the interviews where the interviewee laughed. And I wondered what that meant, like were the interviewees sort of fondly recalling their experiences with Pollution Probe as activities of their youth that they were proud of, but, were thinking about themselves as younger people?
Yeah, I'm certain that the people I spoke to a T, were proud of what they did in their youth. And I think the laughter came because they're thinking of something that they were very proud of, but it also took a lot of gumption to be an early environmental activist, to be a veteran of the movement. They were gutsy people. And, when you talk about the guerrilla theater and the spectacle of it all, or some of the other activities, or even just remembering some of the people they worked with. I mean, they worked hard, they did good work, but, you're going to burn out dealing exclusively with environmental problems if you can't have a good laugh and enjoy the people you're around. So I think there is, some nostalgia there, some pride in their work, and, when I think about what I wore to school in junior high, I'll get a giggle. So, there's some of that too.
Yeah, and you have, recollections of stories of some pretty extraordinary actions, like the couple who broke into the Bruce Peninsula nuclear facility to unfurl a banner?
Yeah, so that's early Greenpeace. They staged a canoe invasion to demonstrate in their minds the lack of security as this nuclear center was being built. And, they were thinking in their minds, well, we'll sneak in past security using a canoe. And once we get into the site, we'll unfurl this banner and, the media will love it. It'll be great. Well, they had no problem sneaking in because there's only one security guard on site who would go around every 45 minutes, so they're able to time it. The only problem is they only got one picture from this whole event because, well, they were brand new to this and they didn't know what they were doing. In fact, I was told that one of the people who was responsible for bringing a camera was a scientist, came from that background. So he brought along a camera that would develop images onto glass slides. So, it wasn't the most practical. But yeah, there's all kinds of examples of people going out on a limb trying to raise awareness for issues they really cared about.
And they got caught, too.
Yeah, they got caught. And according to them, this is in the early 70s, and they were able to get away without really getting in trouble. They were apprehended, held, up until they mentioned they were part of Greenpeace, which by this time is, internationally known. And they were released, and then members were, some stuck around hoping to talk to local media. Another member is sent off to Toronto to talk in the studio at the CBC, do some interviews. But yeah, they did something gutsy and they got caught. And once they mentioned their affiliation, boom, they more or less found that they were able to get away with it with a stern warning not to come back.
Yeah. I was actually quite surprised by that. I couldn't imagine that happening today. Um,
No. Well, I think the key there is that they did this before it was fully operational.
right. Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm sure it would have been much more, much more than a slap on the wrist.
So thinking about pollution probe more broadly, from your perspective, why is this organization significant for understanding the history of environmental activism in Ontario and maybe even Canada more broadly?
Yeah, there's a few things I bring up when people ask me that. First of all, pollution probe played a very important role in changing the way policy concerning the environment is made. Uh, it used to be that policy was made between government and corporations exclusively regarding environmental matters. There was no representatives of the public good, and definitely no one who's specifically an environmentalist at the negotiation tables. What we see is as pollution probe's able to not just assert itself as a prominent environmental activist group, but also as a reputable group,
Mm-hmm.
in part because it's affiliated with the Department of Zoology at the University of Toronto. They're able to make the claim that they're representing the environmental interests of Ontario and its population. And to a lesser extent, this is also done by the Canadian Environmental Law Association, the legal spin-off of Pollution Probe during this time. So we see as the 70s wear on that increasingly the environmentalists are able to show up, whether it's public hearings into energy and the expansion of Ontario Hydro or other planning matters that have an effect on the environment. Pollution Probe and the Canadian Environmental Law Association are among the first environmental activist organizations to really get themselves at the table. So that's important in itself,
Mm-hmm.
changing the model. But also, I think it's really important to look at who Pollution Probe is. The idea, as Christopher Basso said in his book, Environment Inc., Origins Matter. We have this idea that the environmentalists are leftists, that, well, if you listen to some of the criticisms coming from Ottawa, they'll say that they're extremists, that they're terrorists. Well, that's not who environmentalists are. Yes, there's a small fringe, but you could say that about any group in society. When you look at Pollution Probe, you see that they're very much rooted in the mainstream. They're, again, not ideologically based. They're based on getting results. They have support from the Conservative Party. They have support from the opposition in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, by being a reputable group, they're able to do good work, but they're also influential on developing the movement throughout the country. They're helping, they have all these affiliates that pop up throughout the country. They're doing workshops helping groups such as SPEC in British Columbia, the Ecology Action Center in Halifax. They're doing workshops showing them how to fundraise, how to hold effective campaigns, how to deal with politicians, all of that. So here's a group that's tremendously influential, not just in Ontario, but nationwide. And they're totally mainstream. One of the early supporters of Pollution Probe, a faculty member named Ralph Brinkhurst, he pointed out how clean cut and how well-spoken members of their leadership core are. He pointed out they weren't hairy radicals. Again, they did have hairy radicals in the group, but not necessarily the leadership core. And these are people that were palatable to the powers that be. And from the beginning, these people are exerting influence at home and throughout the country. So when I hear people talk about environmentalists as if, they all are out there and fringe members, it's totally wrong. And this historical study proves that that's not the basis of environmental activism in Canada. It's always, from the beginning, been part of the mainstream.
So I think this is a good response to what Stephen Bocking wrote about recently on his website about the historiography of environmentalism. he argued, is he noticed at least a lot of the books on environmentalism that have been written globally focus on origin stories. Now, your book is focused on environmental activism, but you're suggesting here an origin story really matters.
Yeah, I mean, this is the benefit of studying history. We know where this group came from. Why did they make the decisions they made? Why were they so palatable to the powers that be?
Mm-hmm.
Why is all this the case? Well, if you look at who the early leadership is, they infused them with this sense that we can work with people, that we can work with business and politicians, and if they don't do what we want, well, we'll give them a hard time publicly.
Mm-hmm.
But no, that's how Pollution Probe ended up who it is. Just like Greenpeace, their origin story, they're coming out of the New Left and counterculture in British Columbia, and their very first activity was trying to stop nuclear explosion in the Aleutian Islands. So what do? They decide to jump in a boat that they rent and try to get into the detonation zone to stop it. Well, the story is they didn't get into the detonation zone, but that's where their direct action tactics come from. Mm-hmm. It's from the groups and the inspirations they had and their first event. That's why they're known for direct action tactics, and Pollution Probe to this day is known for working with stakeholders.
So this is a trickier question, I think, for historians, but maybe you want to take a crack at it. For environmental activists today, are there lessons that can be drawn from the history of Pollution Probe? You suggest that the organization had early success because it was mainstream, that it worked with government and business, and yet by the end of the 1970s, it seemed to me that their dependence on government and business became a liability as their finances began to dry up. What do you think environmentalists can learn from this history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what I see when I look at this story is the value in diversity, but also flexibility. So when I say flexibility, Pollution Probe, that results-driven approach, I think that trumps ideology. That's what I draw from this. But also the diversity of the movement. I mean, I've spoken to people that are involved with various organizations, and they said, it's great you have Pollution Probe that'll go and talk to organizations. Then there's Greenpeace that'll come in, act tough. They'll have a little bit of machismo, but they'll bring in their direct action tactics. And, then a group such as Pollution Probe can say, play good cop versus Greenpeace's bad cop. And I know for a fact when they were dealing with acid rain in the 1980s, and all the groups were concerned with that, the most prominent was the Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain. But all of these groups would work together, whether it was a stated strategy or it was just understood. Greenpeace will play bad cop, Pollution Probe will come in, try to work out, some sort of compromise that, is good. That's where diversity of the movement comes in really handy. And while I'm totally supportive and I like the idea of being results driven the way Pollution Probe is, I also see the benefit of having the Greenpeace and having other organizations that take different approaches.
Well, listeners, if you're interested in learning more about Pollution Probe, you can pick up a copy of The First Green Wave, Pollution Probe and the Origins of Environmental Activism in Ontario from UBC Press. It's available now, and it's available as an ebook as well from Google Play, and we'll put links up to that on our show notes page for this episode. Ryan, I want to thank you for telling us more about your book and your research.
Hey, thanks so much. And if people want to learn any more, they can check out my website. It's my name, ryano'connor.ca. There's lots more there. There's contact information. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on.
Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Ryan O'Connor and me, Sean Courage. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes page at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast through iTunes and other podcast players, and leave comments. Please let us know what you think about the podcast by leaving comments or writing a short review on our iTunes page. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about environmental history research in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. And you can find out more about the topics we discussed on this episode on our show notes page. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.